from your perspective, we are talking about big stuff here, very complex, messy, multifaceted challenges. How do you think, realistically, StratComms can address the decline of liberal democratic narrative? It's a big question, I know, just get in your brain, pick in your brain on like this multi-$1 million question.
It's a very complex question, indeed. But I think coming back to what we just said about this, I think there is a misunderstanding between the elites and the general public. I think that that's where StratComm is a very important tool that need to be used by policymakers, in the sense that I think that they need to really understand that they need to address the causes rather than only focusing on the symptoms. There is this huge gap between what policymakers try to implement, to incarnate also, and what people understand of it first. So I really think that that would be a good place to start with, trying to get a better understanding of what make people react, what are their interests, what are their vulnerabilities, their grievances, and I think
what you're arguing is, and correct me if I understood wrongly, but is that StratComs can help kind of bridging that gap between policymakers and policymaking and what policies are put in place vis-a-vis how society perceives those policies and how much aware are they of these policies. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, exactly. I think that we really need to narrow this gap between policymakers and the general public. I was talking about misunderstanding, and I really think that it's really about this. From the work we've been doing, from my experience, we also noticed that the local level is something really interesting to consider, in the sense that the lack of trust towards the elites, towards the central power, let's put it this way, is growing. Whereas on the other hand, is at the local level, the lack of trust is maybe more less important. There is more confidence in local politics in general. That's something that can be considered in very important numbers of European countries. So I think it's important because there is this say-do gap between between the elites and the general public. And when it comes to local level, people are more, the relationship is closer, because obviously there is the possibility to go straight to the people implementing policies, to talk with them. So I would say that this is something very interesting to consider, the fact that at the local level, people feel that they are more able to have this relationship, this direct link with the people who are implementing policies, whereas there are these huge gap between the elites and the general public at the national level.
Charlotte, may I ask you, from your experience, to give us a concrete example, whether it's real or ideal, you will tell us. We don't need to know where this example exists. But just to give a concrete idea about what you mean by that, what would be, in your view, a very good example of StratComms as a mean to reconcile the central versus local?
Maybe I would use an example that I got from a very recent event that we've been organizing within the RAM policy support. We had a journalist sharing her experience because she's working really closely with the local level in France. And she was mentioning few examples of very concrete situations where we had we could see the influence of global crisis on the local level. And she was referring to the 7th of October events. And she was showing us very various examples of situations where in all over France, actually, there is a huge impact. Obviously, it's exactly the same in all European countries, but let's say that in France, it has a major impact. It still has, and I think it will be a national trauma for a very, very long time. She was referring to examples of anti-Semitic attacks, but also anti-Muslim protests, attacks. There are very, very there've been a massive rise of anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim demonstrations recently in France. So this is something very concerning. And what she was mentioning, sorry for being so long, but she was mentioning the fact that at the local level, it was easier to get responses from local government. They are more engaged with journalists on the local level. It's really easier for them, for journalists, to have direct conversation. They just need to grab their phone and they can have very rapidly concrete answers to what is going on. Not saying that it's easy for local government, local policies, local police, sorry, to have this conversation. What is at stake is still complicated, but the fact that there is an ongoing process, an ongoing information between the two, an ongoing conversation is key, because it allows the general public to get a sense of what is going on. It's a process, it takes time, it's complicated, but still, if you can have these conversations, it's really help to narrow this gap between a concern coming from the general public about a crisis, whatever it might be, a global or a very local one, and an understanding of what policymakers are trying to do.
Elliot, from your perspective, I mean, Charlotte has, I think, highlighted a very important point about the need for StratComms and the potential for StratComms of in bridging really the gap between central and local. She has just given an example of what's going on in France with the post October 7th protests, and how much really at the local level. Sometimes governments can do things that at the central level would just take longer, and so therefore they would be jeopardized in a certain way in their effectiveness. I think this is a crucial point. What would you add to that in terms of how StratComs can address what we have said as being the decline of the liberal democratic narrative?
I start with the same way that Charlotte started. It's a very complex question, and I think there's very different ways of looking at it. And I think Charlotte has touched on there the say-do gap and the distance from the governors to the governed, and how that creates frustration. I think the thing I would add to that is that the expectation of being able to speak to your leaders has changed. So the advent of social media has framed that, in that if you've got a complaint about something you've bought from a company and you talk about it on social media, you expect a response from the company at the highest levels, and you get it. And the ways companies frame their communication with their customers is very much, you feel like you're being spoken to by the most senior levels. That isn't always the case, but that's the feeling you get from the companies. And when it's done well, that's certainly how it's done. Government communication and government use of social media is still hasn't caught up with that. And I think that has created this sense of frustration, which doesn't help with this sense of decline of, we say liberal democratic values. I mean, I'm going to say sort of in their broadest sense, because liberalism gets us into troubles of political as well as sort of the philosophical side of things. But that has created frustration with the system in which we live in Europe, let's put it that way, and the Western world. And that is also exacerbated by the fact that a lot of the things that underpinned the narrative sort of through the Cold War, post-World War II, was the economic prosperity. People felt like even if days were difficult, there were routes for things to get better. There was the social security net in Europe. There were routes to better work. You could reasonably expect that your children would have a better life than you. That has gone. And I think that has gone at the same time as the rest of the world has, through, you know, the prosperity of open trade and free markets and capitalism, and the success in some respects of large parts of Western philosophy and Western political ways of living. The rest of the world is catching up. That is a good thing for overall human prosperity. It is a bad thing for the narrative in Europe and the sense of things always getting better. Coupled that with the sense of uncertainty that comes from the rapid technological change, couple that with the declining security prospects, it creates this whole new dynamic in which certainties that people had weren't there. There's a lot of uncertainty. And that comes at the same time as the expectations of what people get from their governing elites has shifted. So that is what undermines this whole system that, in some respects, Western governments have been complacent about. And it has enabled them to govern in a certain way and do things in a certain way and run democracy in a certain way that will have to shift. And they aren't shifting fast enough to catch up with what people want. That then leads to, and I'm going to use an example now of the narratives that then get set in place that aren't necessarily the truth, but help people frame the challenge. So, for example, if you look at the issue of immigration, immigration does have broad-scale policy implications on housing, health, jobs, etc. But there are other factors that are causing changes to access to housing, access to jobs, challenges in those systems. It's not all related to immigration, but immigration has become a really easy totemic point to call on for political purposes. So then you get all government what am I trying to say? All political parties having the conversation about immigration, because that is the way it has been framed. They are then responding to the symptom, not the cause, if that makes sense. It comes back to what Charlotte was saying. They are responding to the public demand for immigration to be handled, because immigration has been framed as the cause of these problems. There are lots of other causes of those problems. So rather than addressing the causes underneath that, they're ending up addressing the one that is politically totemic. And that is what's driving it. So my final point is just going to be the democracy has become too much about polls and polling and governing to what the polls are saying, rather than setting a vision and selling a vision and trying to address the underlying causes that people then see in their day-to-day lives as being the problem.